And we are seeing ICE presence here in Northeast Florida this week.
Right. Agents were spotted running joint operations with FHP throughout our area.
Florida, they're trying to get their hands on your money.
Yeah, so the FBI is warning, don't fall for it. As News4JAX reporter Aaron Farrar tells us, these scammers are using threats.
Preliminary interagency threat assessment. If the records inside Pier 19 matched the confidential source reporting, then a criminal consortium had not merely infiltrated commerce. It had purchased influence over segments of the American supply chain. At 4:27 a.m. on November 14, 2025, that assessment stopped being theoretical. The target was a refrigerated import warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront, 3 blocks from the Red Hook container terminal. Externally, the site looked routine. Dock lights, pallet jacks, a night foreman's sedan cooling in the lot, bills of lading clipped to a dispatch board, then FBI New York Homeland Security Investigations and IRS-CI executed the federal warrant window and breached through the side maintenance corridor. Behind a false cold storage wall, these agents entered a room that had never appeared on any construction filing. There were currency counters, satellite phones, a bank of encrypted tablets, a dry erase map stretching from New York through 15 other states, with 11 overseas lanes marked in grease pencil from Panama, Malta, Rotterdam, Kingston, Limassol, Dubai, and Santo Domingo. On a steel shelf sat binders labeled with names no freight company should ever share with a waterfront warehouse, campaign finance contacts, public contract amendments, union dispatch rosters, customs clearance overrides. The numbers were worse. A preliminary count tied the room to $320 million already positioned for restraint actions, $980 million in traced criminal proceeds, and a command structure touching 16 states before sunrise. This was not a smuggling group renting space on a pier. And it was a political criminal nexus using legitimate freight architecture to move money, protected cargo, and official favors through the same national corridors that carried food, medical supplies, and commercial imports. The public version of the story would call it a syndicate takedown. The internal version was colder. A criminal network had learned how to route itself through government-adjacent infrastructure, and Pier 19 was only the first room. To understand how federal agents reached that room, investigators had to go back 9 months to a breakdown that looked too minor to matter. On February 6, 2025, inspectors at a logistics yard in Elizabeth, New Jersey, pulled a refrigerated trailer after the driver argued aggressively against a secondary manifest review. The cargo was listed as seafood. The count matched. And the seal numbers did not. Inside an insulated side cavity, inspectors recovered counterfeit customs placards, payroll envelopes, and 2 visitor badges for facilities the driver had no legal reason to access. His name was Darren Malloy, a contract hauler with a thin operating history and a phone full of contacts that made no commercial sense. A labor dispatcher in Newark, a legislative aide in Albany, a real estate closer in Miami, a bonded warehouse broker in Chicago. On their own, none of those contacts proved conspiracy. Together, they were abnormal. The anomaly widened 3 weeks later. A New York State emergency refrigeration contract tied to publicly subsidized food distribution sites was amended twice in rapid succession, then routed through a vendor tree that overlapped with one of Malloy's freight contacts. Our Treasury analysts noticed the money splitting across consulting retainers, campaign event reimbursements, and trucking surcharges. The payments were small enough to avoid panic. They were also disciplined enough to suggest design. By March, the FBI had opened a joint public corruption and racketeering assessment under compartmented handling. Surveillance warrants followed. So did financial subpoenas. Soon the same network markers appeared around city warehousing contracts, labor staffing invoices, port access clearances, and cold chain routing exceptions. That was the first shift. What began as cargo irregularity became contract irregularity. Contract irregularity became access irregularity. And once those 3 patterns started overlapping, investigators stopped asking whether one freight company was compromised. And they started asking whether a criminal enterprise had embedded itself inside the commercial and political systems that determine how goods move across state lines. By late spring, the investigative wall chart at the FBI's New York field office had outgrown one conference room. The syndicate structure was not organized by borough or street crew. It was organized by function. New York handled command, fundraising access, and East Coast maritime coordination. New Jersey buffered bonded storage and trucking relay. Pennsylvania and Ohio carried warehousing and inland transfer. Illinois handled secondary freight redistribution. Georgia and Florida processed shell hospitality, import laundering, and offshore return channels. Texas and California absorbed procurement money through real estate and logistics consulting. Like smaller nodes in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, Michigan, North Carolina, and Louisiana supported staffing, escrow, political bundling, or route insulation. 42 shell companies sat on top of the machine: Alder Basin Logistics, North Fork Civic Supply, Meridian Cold Transit, Harbor Lantern Events, Eastline Workforce Solutions, Essex Port Advisory. On paper, they had different purposes. In practice, they touched the same accounting intermediaries, the same nominee officers, the same secondary legal counsel, and the same protected routing windows. The financial trail explained the size of the threat. Treasury and IRS-CI ultimately traced $980 million in criminal proceeds moving through the network. Some of the money came from freight theft. Some came from labor coercion, counterfeit imports, procurement kickbacks, illegal gambling, and extortion. But the method stayed constant. Dirty revenue entered the system as transport cost, vendor reimbursement, emergency supply procurement, union-linked consulting, or campaign-adjacent event spending. Once enough legitimate hands touched it, the money stopped looking criminal. Then the institutional layer surfaced. A port security contractor in Brooklyn flagged inspection calendars before they were public. A union-connected dispatcher quietly steered desirable routes away from honest carriers. A deputy procurement advisor in Albany padded refrigeration amendments that redirected public funds into syndicate-controlled subcontractors. A city political consultant in Queens arranged fundraiser access for men who appeared nowhere on official company charts, but kept showing up near shell company closings and warehouse lease signings. The public case could still have been framed as bribery plus logistics fraud. That was the simple version. The private case file was darker. Investigators were looking at a protected commercial architecture in which criminal revenue, public process, and interstate freight movement no longer operated as separate systems. The machinery worked because modern supply chains are fragmented by design. A container entered through a port. A broker handled the customs paperwork. A warehouse logged cold storage. A staffing vendor supplied loaders. A carrier moved the trailer inland. A second subcontractor handled last-mile transfer. A public agency, somewhere further down the line, approved emergency reimbursement or procurement adjustment when delays or spoilage were reported. Each layer had a legitimate role. Each layer also offered a point of exploitation. What looked like distribution was actually concealment. The syndicate used cold chain freight as its preferred cover because temperature-sensitive cargo already travels under time pressure, documentation complexity, and high spoilage anxiety. If a pallet disappeared, it could be written off as damage. If a trailer was rerouted, it could be blamed on refrigeration failure. If emergency invoices appeared, public agencies often processed them quickly to avoid disruption. That urgency became the syndicate's camouflage. The political side amplified the effect. Friendly procurement officials created amendment lanes. The friendly dispatchers moved trucks into low-scrutiny corridors. Friendly consultants warned when inspections were intensifying. Friendly labor vendors placed compliant crews inside warehouses where unauthorized relabeling, cargo substitution, or document swaps could occur after hours. The network did not need to control every step. It needed to control enough choke points to make honest oversight unreliable. Internationally, the same logic scaled outward. 11 overseas routes functioned as financial and cargo pivots. Some moved counterfeit goods or undeclared luxury items. Some returned laundered capital as clean investment money. Some existed mainly to provide offshore ownership layers and escrow insulation. By the time money or merchandise came back into the United States, it appeared attached to respectable corporate actors. That was the core of the threat. The syndicate had not built a parallel black market supply chain. It had learned to inhabit the legitimate one, siphoning value and protection from the friction points of ordinary commerce. The central figure was Adrian Vale, 57, chairman of Meridian Cold Transit, and a familiar face at civic infrastructure panels, trade dinners, and charity galas. Publicly, he spoke the language of resilience, ports, and regional growth. According to the indictment, he was the command broker who linked freight routes to political access and criminal finance. Below him sat Lena Ferraro, 45, a procurement attorney whose specialty was emergency amendment language. She did not move cargo. She moved paper. Her role was to make abnormal vendor expansions look administratively necessary. Noah Reyes, 38, ran field logistics. He controlled trucks, relay depots, labor placement, and contingency routes when enforcement or labor disputes disrupted primary corridors. In intercepted messages, Reyes spoke less like a gangster than a distribution manager under deadline pressure. Then there was Patrick Hume, 61, a union-adjacent dispatcher with deep relationships across New York and New Jersey yards. Hume did not need formal authority over everything. He only needed enough operational credibility to influence who got the sensitive runs and who did not. The insider pivot came from government. Maya Collins, 42, deputy director for vendor integrity review on a state procurement task force, appeared at first to be peripheral. She was not. Investigators concluded Collins helped identify which public contracts could absorb inflated amendments without immediate audit escalation. She did not simply protect the syndicate from scrutiny. She helped design lanes through which scrutiny could be delayed. That was the elite layer, not street power, administrative power. Operation Granite Harbor was authorized at 2:55 a.m. Eastern on November 14th and executed in synchronized phases beginning at 3:48. FBI New York retained command authority. DOJ Public Integrity and Organized Crime Sections coordinated charge sequencing. HSI, IRS-CI, U.S. Marshals, CBP specialists, and state-level investigative units operated under staggered tasking across 16 states to reduce the risk of pre-action leakage. Phase 1 targeted continuity. At 3:48, Treasury and IRS-CI initiated restraints against 24 primary financial accounts and secondary brokerage structures tied to syndicate shell entities. At 3:56, digital exploitation teams entered 2 Manhattan legal suites, one accounting office in Long Island City and a bonded storage administrator's office in Newark. At 4:03, the Brooklyn Pier warehouse was breached. At 4:09, agents entered a trucking dispatch center in Kearney. By 4:17, parallel teams were executing warrants in Philadelphia, Chicago, Atlanta, Miami, Dallas, and Los Angeles against relay nodes identified as critical to the interstate network. The first returns suggested decisive collapse. Servers were live, key offices were dark, accounts were frozen before dawn. Then the operation split. At 5:11, analysts exploiting Maya Collins's work tablet found a continuity memorandum labeled East Corridor Recovery. It contained alternate shell vendors, substitute route brokers, and one unserved contact tree tied to a procurement safe site outside Albany. That changed the operational picture immediately. The case was no longer about taking down the commercial front. It was about intercepting the political repair mechanism before it reconstituted the network. Follow-on warrants were drafted in real time. By 6:02, agents entered the Albany address and recovered contract binders, fundraiser seating charts, and draft amendment templates designed for emergency use if primary vendors were seized. In Miami, a charter accounting office tried to execute offshore beneficiary changes and was stopped mid-transfer. In Illinois, a warehouse manager attempted to destroy route ledgers in a floor incinerator. In Texas, a nominee real estate closer walked into a seizure team carrying beneficial owner papers for shell assets not yet public. By the close of the first operational day, 30 kingpins had been captured across states, and 87 total arrests had been executed or federally lodged. 42 shell companies were under enforcement review. 11 international routes had been disrupted. $320 million in cash, accounts, property interests, rolling assets, and brokerage positions had been frozen or restrained. That was the public ending. Operationally, it was only containment, because the evidence showed the syndicate had built itself to survive loss, and federal authorities had spent the day racing its contingency plans. The evidence inventory was not cinematic. It was bureaucratically devastating. Agents seized 63 encrypted devices, 29 route ledgers, 118 contract and escrow binders, warehouse access logs, dispatch rosters, union contact lists, customs override messages, political fundraiser calendars, and offshore ownership packets. The material did not merely show association. It showed synchronized behavior across commerce, politics, and criminal finance. Treasury's reconstruction fixed the broader proceeds picture at $980 million. That figure included cargo diversion revenue, procurement kickbacks, extortion payments, illegal gambling flows, labor exploitation income, and laundering returns. $320 million in assets had been frozen early enough to interrupt the command structure's recovery plan. Most damaging were the crossover records, a route ledger beside a donor event seating chart, a public refrigeration amendment tied to a shell company invoice, a labor dispatch sheet synced to a protected cargo window. Those are the kinds of links that change a case from fraud to enterprise corruption. The question was no longer whether criminals had bribed officials. The question was how long segments of legitimate governance had been quietly helping the syndicate route risk, money, and influence through ordinary supply channels. The costs were not abstract. Evan Brooks, owner of a small refrigerated carrier in Newark, spent 2 years losing contracts to firms that always seemed to know the amendment language before it went public, and always underbid him by margins that made no commercial sense. The federal agents later told him several of those competitors were shell-controlled vendors designed to choke honest operators out of sensitive lanes. Rosa Medina, a warehouse clerk in the Bronx, told investigators she watched night crews reseal loads and relabel paperwork after supervisors told staff not to ask questions if they wanted steady hours. She stayed because her mother's medication depended on the job. That is how protected systems endure, not only through power at the top, but through fear and dependency below. Cities also paid. Public agencies overpaid for emergency storage. Honest contractors were sidelined. Inspection systems were manipulated. Once the syndicate bent commerce and governance together, the victims included anyone who relied on public contracts, transparent freight markets, or the assumption that infrastructure decisions were being made for lawful reasons. By early 2026, federal prosecutors had filed racketeering, bribery, money laundering, wire fraud, honest services fraud, procurement corruption, cargo theft conspiracy, extortion, and labor exploitation-related charges against the principal defendants and dozens of secondary actors. Additional referrals moved through parallel grand jury review involving campaign finance exposure, procurement misconduct, and state ethics violations. Ports tightened access. Carrier licensing reviews reopened. Emergency contract amendments across multiple states were re-audited. Those responses were necessary. They were not closure, because the deepest lesson of the case was methodological. The syndicate did not thrive because it was unusually violent, and it thrived because it was administratively literate. It understood how public urgency distorts oversight, how logistics fragmentation weakens accountability, and how political access can be rented just long enough to bend a route, an amendment, a dispatch roster, or a compliance window. It did not need every official. It needed enough of them, in enough places, to make honest process unpredictable. That is why the headline numbers matter. 30 kingpins arrested, 87 total arrests, $980 million in criminal proceeds traced, 16 states involved in coordinated enforcement, 11 international routes dismantled, 42 shell companies exposed, $320 million in assets frozen. Those figures describe a successful takedown. They do not erase the architecture that made it possible. On one seized drive recovered from the Pier 19 room, analysts found planning memos for replacement vendors in 2 states not central to the first indictment, along with draft notes referencing continuity donors, reserve contract lanes, and Western diversion capacity. The language was dry, procedural, almost forgettable. That was the warning. The network had already planned for partial survival inside the same legal, commercial, and political systems that had helped it grow. So the final assessment remains restrained and severe. This was not merely an international crime syndicate moving illicit proceeds across state lines. It was a demonstration that complex infrastructure can be captured in increments. One broker, one amendment, one dispatch favor, one fundraiser, one shell company at a time. And New York happened to be the command center in this case. It was not the only place the model could function. Federal agents broke the network by forcing those increments into a single evidentiary frame. Whether institutions keep that frame intact after the arrests is the part that will determine if the syndicate was destroyed or simply interrupted.